There's a generation that watched an estimated 20,000 TV commercials a year before they turned 10, and it accidentally gave them a superpower nobody planned for. Not boomers, not millennials, the one everybody forgets exists. While researchers panic about how algorithms hijack our attention, Gen X is sitting in the corner, unbothered, muttering, "We've seen this trick before. It just used to wear a suit and sell a cereal." And here's the strange part. The exact childhood conditions experts once called neglect may be the reason this generation is so hard to manipulate today. Stick around, because by the end of this, you'll understand why the most ignored generation became the most immune one, and what that means for the rest of us. Let's start with a concept psychologists actually use: inoculation theory. Developed by William McGuire back in the 1960s, it works exactly like a vaccine. Expose someone to a weakened form of persuasion, let them build defenses, and they become resistant to the full-strength version later. Now think about what Gen X's childhood actually was. They grew up in the golden age of blatant, unapologetic, in-your-face advertising. Saturday morning cartoons that were legally allowed to be 30-minute toy commercials. He-Man wasn't a show, it was a product catalog with a plot. And crucially, everyone kind of knew it. Researchers who study persuasion knowledge, that's the actual academic term from Frystad and Wright's persuasion model published in 1994, found that once people recognize an attempt to persuade them, the attempt loses power. It gets flagged, filed under "someone wants something from me." Gen X got that recognition training daily for decades in low-stakes doses. Cereal box promises, infomercials at 2 a.m., but wait, there's more. The manipulation was loud, and loud manipulation teaches you what manipulation sounds like. Here's where it gets darker and more interesting. Gen X were the latchkey kids. By some estimates in the 1980s, millions of American children regularly came home to empty houses. Divorce rates roughly doubled between the 1960s and 1980. Both parents worked, supervision was theoretical. Sociologists have described the result as a generation with unusually early self-reliance. And self-reliance does something specific to your relationship with information. When no adult is around to verify claims for you, you become the verification department. Is this stranger trustworthy? Is this deal real? Is this free vacation phone call actually free? A latchkey 10-year-old answering the landline in 1983 was running fraud detection with zero backup. That's not trauma talking. That's a trained skill. Psychologists called the broader trait skeptical processing, defaulting to evaluation instead of acceptance. Compare that to growing up with helicopter parenting in curated digital environments where trust decisions were largely outsourced. Neither is better morally, but only one builds the muscle. Now here's the angle almost nobody talks about. Modern manipulation, outrage bait, parasocial marketing, FOMO drops, influencer authenticity depends on one thing: sincerity capture. It needs you to take the message at face value emotionally for a few seconds. That's the window where the hook sets. Gen X's cultural firmware makes that window almost impossible to open. This is the generation that made detached irony a default mode, the generation of whatever. Their formative media mocked media itself, Letterman deconstructing talk shows on a talk show, The Simpsons parodying the sitcom family while being one, MTV selling rebellion and winking about it. When your entertainment constantly says, "this is fake," and we both know it, you develop critical distance, watching the frame, not just the picture. And critical distance is kryptonite to manipulation, because today's techniques hide the frame. The influencer isn't advertising, she's sharing. The outrage post isn't engagement farming, it's raising awareness. It only works if you don't see the frame. Gen X always sees the frame. They were raised inside its blueprints. There's one more piece, and it's got a proper name: psychological reactance. Jack Brem's theory from 1966. When people feel their freedom of choice is being pushed, they push back. Hard. Sometimes they do the opposite thing just on principle. Every generation has reactance. Gen X weaponized it. Think about what they lived through as trust collapsed in real time. Watergate hangover, the 1987 crash, corporate downsizing waves that shredded their parents' loyal employee life scripts. Pew Research has documented the long slide of Americans' trust in government from the high 70% in the 1960s down to around 20% in recent decades. Gen X grew up during the steepest part of that fall. The result is a generation whose default answer to "everyone's doing it" is, "then I'm definitely not." Notice what that does to modern manipulation tactics. Social proof, 10,000 people bought this today, bounces off. Urgency, only 2 left, triggers suspicion, not panic. Authority signaling, experts agree, gets a raised eyebrow and a "which experts? Funded by whom?" Cialdini's classic principles of influence still work on most people most of the time. On Gen X, half of them fire backwards. And here's the delicious irony the marketing industry won't say out loud. It eventually surrendered. Look at the ads actually aimed at Gen X. Self-aware, sarcastic, openly admitting, yes, this is an ad. Sprite literally built a campaign on "image is nothing." When advertisers have to confess the manipulation just to get your attention, that's not a strategy, that's a white flag. Gen X didn't just resist persuasion, they forced persuasion to evolve around them. Now, before Gen X viewers get too smug in the comments, there's a catch, because there's always a catch. Immunity to one pathogen isn't immunity to all of them. Research on scam victimization keeps producing an inconvenient finding. Everyone believes they're too savvy to be fooled, and that belief itself is a vulnerability. The FTC's own data has shown that younger adults report losing money to fraud more often than older ones, but when older adults do get hit, they lose more. Different doors, same house. And Gen X's specific armor, cynicism, has a known failure mode. Blanket distrust is cheap. It rejects everything equally, which means it can reject true things right alongside manipulation. Researchers who study misinformation distinguish between skepticism, which asks, "What's the evidence?" and cynicism, which just says, "Everything's rigged." And the second one is, ironically, easy to exploit. Tell a cynic the mainstream is lying, and you can sell them an alternative that's lying harder. So the Gen X superpower isn't distrust, it's calibrated distrust, earned through 20,000 cereal commercials, empty houses, and watching institutions faceplant on live television. There's also a blind spot hiding in plain sight. Nostalgia. The one emotional channel Gen X never firewalled is their own past. Slap a synthwave soundtrack and a Trapper Keeper on any product, and the generation that scoffs at influencers suddenly opens its wallet. Manipulation researchers called us the affect heuristic, feelings standing in for judgment. And for Gen X, 1985 is the feeling. The shield covers everything except the decade it was forged in. So what's the actual takeaway for everyone who isn't Gen X? You can't go back and get raised by a speak and spell in an empty living room, but the inoculation logic still holds. Exposure to visible manipulation builds resistance to invisible manipulation. Study old ads. Watch how the trick works when it's loud, so you recognize it when it whispers. Gen X never asked to be the control group for the attention economy. They just came home from school, made their own dinner, watched 4 hours of commercials, and accidentally became the last generation the algorithm has to work overtime to fool. They won't brag about it, though. That would require caring what you think. If this earned it, subscribe. No urgency, no fake scarcity. Gen X taught us better than that.